Okay, so it's been about a year or so since I did the last video, and I know it's taken longer than planned. But in this video, the whole idea is like the last one to walk you through what's happened over the last couple of months, what impact that's had, and then whether there are things that you can take away from it for yourself. So first of all, obviously, let's go through the timeline. So in terms of what's actually happened, now after I did the last video, essentially, so this was roughly October, November, right? So the main focus around that time was still immersion. Now, the immersion at the time was really a combination of a couple of different things. It was some reading in the month of October, about 2 hours per day of immersion, 1 hour of italki, so that's essentially a language teacher just having a random chat with me. And then way more focus on listening than reading. The main reason being that when you read, you have your own sort of internal voice as you read what's going on, right? Let's say you read a story, you hear your own voice and your interpretation of the characters and the words that you see on the page. My issue with that is that we're assuming that the pronunciation and the way you say things in your head is correct. So this is one of the reasons that I spent less time. I haven't read a huge amount in my learning process, but it's one of the reasons I don't do much reading is because the input I want to have, I don't want to solidify my own pronunciation patterns. I want to take what I hear a native speaker say, and when I try and say something, I want the sentence in my head, or when I read something, to be as close to that person's pronunciation, intonation as possible. And I feel like if I just focus on reading, even though at times I really wanted to spend a lot of time reading, it would probably be detrimental long term. That's if you care about pronunciation. So what did I do? So I spent more time on things like podcasts, mainly again for the listening, right? The audio input is really, for me, one of the key things. Audio input. Watching shows is another thing I did around that time. And initially with subtitles, and that would be Chinese subtitles, not English subtitles, and then essentially cutting subtitles completely. Now, there's a couple of things that happen. I don't know if you've experienced this, but let's say you start watching a show. In the first episode, you might not understand a huge amount. And then in the second episode, and then you start understanding more and more and more. And by about episode 2 or 3, you actually really tuned into the way that people speak. One thing that I should say is that when you use subtitles, obviously you can spend a lot of time reading along if you can read all the characters, but it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of detrimental to the listening skills. So when you take them away, you have to focus even more to listen to what they're saying, which I think is invaluable, at least at a certain point. I think watching with subtitles is really useful, but there's a point where you basically have to cut them, and then depending on the level of the show, if it's much harder than your current level, then it's probably worth having, if it's harder, it's worth having subtitles. If it's easier, or if it's at your level, there are probably times when it's worth watching without subtitles. So that's largely what was happening in that time. So let's go back to that so I can walk you through it. So that's what was happening around that time. Now, then I had a complete drop in motivation, as you can see here. Essentially, from the beginning of 2022 until summer of 2022, I did very, very, very little. We'll go through the sheet in a second as well. My main focus was work. I did basically nothing. I averaged 29 minutes per day of immersion, which would be things like podcast shows, etc., etc. I stopped using or stopped doing the Anki cards in my self-made deck, right, which are essentially sentences and things that I've pulled from shows that I'm watching. and I just focused on a deck that you can get online called Spoon-Fed Chinese. And I just did 10 new cards per day, which is essentially 5 new sentences a day, because on one side is Chinese, the other side is English, and then the second card is essentially a reverse of that. So that's what was happening in that time. Now, one of the huge things that I noticed is my level just plummeted. And what I mean is it plummeted to the level that it was in around September. So almost everything that I'd learned in this, let's call it a more intense phase, got suppressed and became gradually worse. So even though I was doing 10, you could argue that I was doing 5 new sentences, which would be about 5 new words per day, my level wasn't staying at the same level, because the words that were sort of, let's call it more in the short-term memory, were essentially getting dropped, right? I wasn't getting enough exposure to them for my body, for my mind, my brain to go, this is useful, let's keep this. So everything that was still there was stuff that I learned way before. So that was really interesting. A bit infuriating, but interesting. So one thing that I realized had to happen for me, you will probably have something that's a key motivator for you. I'll give you an example. My sister, who's learning Japanese, which I might have said in the other video, the motivation for her is going to Japan. If she goes to Japan, she's really motivated to learn Japanese. If she isn't, she's not particularly motivated. Now, for me, fortunately, it's not something as expensive or as extreme as that. The key, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold. The key motivator for me is interaction, speaking. So I realized in that time frame, in those 6 months, I got a bit annoyed with myself, mainly because I know that if, let's say I'd completely quit, if in 2 years' time I'd thought back and I'd gone, where would your level be at now if you hadn't quit? In 2 years' time, I would have forgotten a huge amount. I would have lost a huge amount. I would have almost had to restart from zero, and I'd probably be mad at myself, right? So I thought, okay, what happens? What points in your life are you really motivated and put in the work that you need to put in? Because ultimately, this is a hobby, right? It has to be an enjoyable process. And for me, it's really interaction. So one of the downsides of having cut interaction and focused more on immersion is that my motivation just started going, because there was no drive to actually use the things. Right now, I also understand why some people say you shouldn't do a lot of speaking at certain points, which I agree with. There needs to be an element of it for me, for my motivation to stay where it is, right? Or for it to be in an ideal place. So in this timeline, there's obviously the huge drop. Now I started doing lessons here, right? This is what it just says italki. I use italki for lessons. Started doing lessons, and immediately my motivation went right. So I did a lot over the summer. Now I set myself the goal of doing 180 hours of immersion in 90 days. So it's in 3 months, right? We can check what I actually did. If you don't remember this sheet, it's one you can, in the previous video, if you want the same sheet, you can find it, links to the video. Someone made this for Japanese. I use it for Mandarin, obviously for Chinese. So this is the time frame in which I was doing nothing, right? This is how many new cards per day. This is the time spent reading. This is the time spent on immersion, on either listening or watching. So there's an audio component. And then this would be the time invested in flashcards. So there was a drop. Right? There's a point where I did 2 there. I did 10 new cards per day, which I said was Spoon-Fed Chinese, right? So this is around April. I did 0 reading, and I did almost no immersion, right? I might have listened a little bit to some podcasts here or there. There's some days with 0, some days were 20 minutes, some days were 10 minutes, as you can see here. And then this was the total time that it took me to do the 10 cards. And then obviously this is just the accumulated time. Now, if we go to when motivation started going up, which would be around July, there was a jump from 11 minutes to 1 hour and 25, 1 hour 59, and a general increase, right? So this is when the goal was set. Now I also started adding something here, which I should go into, which was complete passive immersion. Passive immersion being I'd, for example, do work, and I'd listen to condensed audio. Let me explain to you what condensed audio is if you don't know. Let's say it was a show that I'd watched. The program that I used to make flashcards, called Bigaku, which I think is totally worth it, allows you to create condensed audio. Now, what it does is essentially you can pick the show or the episode, and then you can choose, and then essentially it'll create a compressed audio file of the video. And then you can also skip the times in between when people aren't speaking. So you can re-listen to the show without all the gaps in between where no one's speaking and it's just music, for example, which is actually quite a lot of a show. So let's say it's a 47-minute show, 45-minute show, it ends up being something like an 18-minute audio piece. Right, now you're re-listening to something that you've already watched. It's kind of fun because you know what's happening in the story, but I used it as passive immersion. Passive immersion being my focus was somewhere else, right? So I was focusing on work, for example, but work wasn't so mentally intensive that I couldn't listen to something. There are obviously the times when you don't want to listen to anything. So that's essentially what was happening here, right? If we look at this, this is what I started adding. I started adding the audio component. So, oh, sorry, this was the speaking to someone, when I was speaking to someone, the time invested in speaking. So these are probably lessons. And this was the passive immersion. So 40 minutes, 1 hour, 12 minutes. Now, you don't get a huge amount out of this, except that every now and again you listen in, right? Like if you had the radio or Spotify or something on in the background, every now and again your focus switches from what you're doing to what you're listening to. And you might say a few words along with the song that you're listening to, or you listen into the news on the radio, or whatever it is, right? In this case, it's a show, an episode I've already watched. I rewatch it and I listen in, and I pull pieces from it, and I know exactly which scene it's from. And there might be words that are sort of iffy, right? They're on the verge of being integrated into something more long term. But because I hear it again, my brain goes, "Oh, it's important." So I don't recommend purely passive immersion as a way of learning. I think it's useful. It's a useful tool. I don't think it's the most useful tool. It's pretty far down in terms of importance, for me anyway. So I actually smashed my goal of 180 hours in those 3 months. So again, I started adding new cards to my self-made deck. So I was doing 20 cards a day, 10 being spoon-fed, 10 my self-made. I was doing way more immersion. At one point, I did 10 hours and 31 minutes. This almost the entire day. That's not something, this would have been on a weekend. That's not something I can normally do on a day-to-day weekday because of work, right? So on average, it was way more, substantially more than 2 hours. And then obviously the time on the flashcards went up because I'm doing 20 cards instead of, 10. So that's essentially what was happening here. Now, there was a huge improvement in that time. One of the big things that I did, which is probably one of my biggest takeaways, is active immersion or interactive immersion. There's probably, I don't know what the official term is for that, but essentially, there are different things you can do, right? You can watch a show, and let's say you watch it with English subtitles. Cool, you listen in, you pull out some words every now and again, and you start associating words with different things, right? You can watch it with native subs. So let's say the show's in Chinese, you watch it with Chinese subs. It's easier almost to follow what's happening. But there's probably a lot of things that you don't know how to say. Now, that's how I was doing my immersion before, or words that you don't understand, right? Interactive or active immersion, whatever you want to call it. What I would do is I would stop and I would look up almost every word that I didn't know. Now, that doesn't mean I was consciously making an effort of making it into a card. I would just, again, the program that I use allows me to do this. I'd hover over the word, highlight it, it would give me a dictionary definition, or different dictionary definitions. If it was a really commonly used word, or if it's a word that I would use in my day-to-day life because it's connected to my job or a hobby or those kind of things, then I would make a flashcard out of it. Otherwise, I just ignore it, forget it. Say it out loud once maybe, and then keep watching. Because the aim was still to enjoy the show, right? Now, this requires way more effort because it requires focus, and you have to sort of look up the different things, but it makes a huge, huge, huge difference, at least in my experience, to how fast you pick things up and how well you integrate new words, because it almost functions like its own flashcard system to an extent, right? Let's say you're watching a show that's a romantic drama. You could have a word that means proclaiming your love, for example, to the person. Now, you might make a flashcard out of it, and you'll see it today or tomorrow, whenever it comes up, and then you'll see it the day after, and then you might see it 3 days later, and so on. Let's say you make the flashcard, and it'll come up in 48 hours because it's behind in terms of the total list. You've now paid attention. You've made a card out of it. You've added the definition. You've looked at the pronunciation. You've heard it. Now, you keep watching the show and the word comes up again. It's almost like its own flashcard system in the sense that you go, what's this word again? It sounds familiar. You look it up and you go, oh, yes, it's this. And then it happens again, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. And it just gets, you then see it on your flashcards, right, later on. It gets integrated much faster. So I find that really useful. That was really, really, really useful for me. If I had known, I would have done it before. If I'd paid attention, I would have done it before and not just gone for the passive, like just watching and enjoying the show. Even though that's, for some people, that might be more fun. For me, seeing it and looking up the words made me make much faster progress than just watching the show. Because ultimately, you're creating flashcards, or I'm creating flashcards from shows that I'm watching. So every now and again, I have to look up words anyway. But yeah, so that's essentially what was going on there. It was a lot of active, maybe an hour a day, and then maybe an hour plus of non-interactive immersion, right? So essentially watching and not looking at the words and just enjoying the show for what it is and paying attention. So that's what was going on there. Huge amount of progress. I had a chat with someone that I know shortly after I'd done those roughly almost 180 days. I think at that point I hadn't reached 180 days yet. I was maybe at 90 or 100 days. And the last time I'd spoken to that person was probably January 2022. They said, and again, this is always subjective, but they said that that I was so much better than I was before. And realistically, I'd had, if you think about the time frame, January to July, I did almost nothing. And then I just bombarded my brain for about 2 months before I had that chat. A lot of the words that I'd forgotten in between came back, but I also added a whole bunch of new words to the point where, because it was a language exchange, there were words that I knew in Chinese that they didn't know in English, which I thought was really interesting. The English level is better than my Chinese level, but still, it was a nice experience to have, and it was a motivating experience to have. So then essentially we get into the issue that I had previously. So obviously we're now around summer, right? So this is the immersion goal. I set the immersion goal. I watched multiple shows. I watched a show that I really enjoyed, Handsome Siblings. It's on Netflix, with English subtitles because the level is just way above me. Obviously, it says here my average immersion was 2 hours and 54 minutes, almost 3 hours a day, right? I watched Heart Signal, which I think is really useful. It's useful watching shows that are things like dating shows and things like that, if you enjoy them, because there are a lot of words that are just used on a day-to-day basis, just normal interaction almost. It's not complicated. There's not a lot of scientific words, so that was really useful. And then I watched some simpler shows, and I just watched them with normal subs. I watched one mandarin anime, essentially. I'll tell you my personal theory. I like watching anime. I don't like watching Chinese anime, because the way the mouth moves isn't in line with what the person is saying. And I think there's a subconscious element to language learning where, and it's something I've realized that I do, is when someone's speaking Mandarin, for example, I pay attention to the way that their mouth moves and how they pronounce the different things. In an anime show, it's all obviously drawn, so that doesn't happen. It's not a true reflection of how you make the sound with your mouth. Don't know if that makes sense. And I don't even know if that's a valid theory, but those are my thoughts, and that's the reason I don't watch much. Every now and again I will, but it's why I don't watch much cartoony stuff in Chinese. And obviously this is when I started doing more passive immersion, re-listening to old shows, using condensed audio, which I've told you about. I then had a massive drop in motivation. So again, what was happening there is I stopped speaking to people, and my sole focus was immersion. My motivation just plummeted because I stopped having the interactions. And I, again, like I said earlier, for me, one of the key drivers of motivation is interaction. And without that, it just plummets. So here's what's happened recently. Over the last week or so, I've restarted. I never stopped, right? That's important to bear in mind. There are times in my learning process where I've completely stopped for multiple months, essentially, but I've never stopped flashcards over the last course of the last year or so, right? I'm still doing new cards now. Again, what I noticed in that time frame when I stopped over the last few months until now is motivation going basically plummeting, and the level dropping in line with that, going back to words that, well, it was better than before when I'd stopped learning, but I could gradually feel it getting worse, even if I was learning new words. So recently I restarted doing immersion, not a crazy amount, but about 1.5, sometimes 2 hours a day. And it's helped hugely again. It's very motivating, but I know now that I need to have interactions with people and talk to someone, whether it's on italki or whether it's language exchange or whatever it is, to keep the motivation up. I think if I had done what I did in summer and what I'm currently doing since I started, I'd be able to speak, like perfectly, not perfectly, but fluently at this point. Anyway, so hopefully that was useful to you. There's a whole bunch of things I wanted to say, and I've probably forgotten half of them. But my aim is to record another one fairly soon, so ideally in December, and then walk you through what's going on there, because there's a couple of little tweaks, changes I want to make, and see what happens there. One thing I should say is that, and you may have experienced this yourself if you're learning a language, if you spend a lot of time doing something like a new language, your mother tongue or mother tongues sometimes become a bit weird, in the sense that, and I've seen this in people who've learned multiple languages, and I have it myself to an extent, because I grew up speaking multiple languages, is where you want to make a sound, you know exactly what sound to make, but for some reason your mouth shifts and uses the muscles that it would use in a different language. You produce a sound that's not the sound you wanted to produce, right? That happens more. And the other thing that happens more is that spelling gets worse. Spelling gets worse. Sometimes you're a little bit uncertain about grammar in your native language, so you write something and it's a weird sentence. You send it to someone and you reread it and you go, this is weird. I don't know why I wrote this, but you just leave it as this, or you can correct it, whatever. But I understand that it's influence from focusing on a different language and the whole sentence structure, or the way that words are used, being different from the native language. So that's it for today. Hopefully you've got a few takeaways or things that you can implement into your own process.